Yeah, this video's late. Bite me. Obviously, it depends on your particular situation and where you are in the world, but 2021 did feel like a better year around these parts. Or at least it did up until December, when we let it rip and collectively tripped over our laces, because some arsehole tied them together. Do what you will with that metaphor. Anyway, toy-wise, it was a better year. Admittedly, still a bit of a weird one, and of course I handled it perfectly well by throwing money at my plastic crack addiction. There were a few carryovers and a bit of baggage from the previous year, but there was also some awesome new stuff too. As always, I'm recording this in January because I still buy stuff right up until December 31st. Also, it's the middle of summer here in Australia, and I've been struggling with the heat and humidity, so for the last few weeks, I just wanted to do sweet FA. The video's premise is still the same. 5 favourite and 5 frustrating toys, new and old, regardless of when they were released, that I've picked up for myself over the previous 12 months. With a few technicalities for good measure. Oh, and a reminder that this is not a best and worst list. Although, that would be better for the algorithm. I don't know, maybe help me out by interacting and sharing this video. It's not necessarily about whether the toy or collectible itself is good or bad. Often it is, but it's also about the experience surrounding it. And with that in mind, let's begin. Super Shredder, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, Secret of the Ooze by Knackered Toys. Here's one of those technicalities I mentioned. I originally pre-ordered this in 2020, however it didn't arrive until January of 2021. Also, the retailer I bought it from didn't take my money until they got their stock in, which was also in that January. So there's your technicality. First of all, this Super Shredder figure is bloody fantastic. The quality, the detail, the fidelity, it's painted just like the original movie costume. Even the reasonable price point is everything we come to expect from NECA toys. And 2 of my previous list videos in the last few years have been praising their movie Ninja Turtles line. So why is it here? Well, my gripe isn't because of the figure itself, it's because of the mess surrounding it. Back in August of 2020, this was made available as pre-order on NECA's online store, and it sold out in what seemed like minutes. There were some assurances that this would be made available outside the US, and soon enough, a number of Aussie retailers had their pre-orders up and ready. But not too long after that, every Aussie listing, suddenly and without warning, were taken down and all pre-orders were cancelled. After a few weeks of searching, I eventually found UK-based Zavvi had it for a great price and was still taking pre-orders, and that's where this came from. It's been over a year, and maybe I didn't dig deep enough, but I never discovered any official word as to why any of that happened. Searching through the interwebs, trawling through the forums, I could only find hearsay and conjecture as to the shenanigans that resulted in Australia missing out. Some claimed a particular retailer jumped the gun, some claim that someone pissed off the supplier, or that the Aussie importer made promises that they had no right making in the first place. Since then, the repainted variants of that Super Shredder have popped up at Aussie retailers with little to no fuss. This issue has been dead for quite some time. However, I bring it up because it seemed like such an aberration. I've spoken before how the Aussie version of Target and the like don't get NECA products like they do in the US. So we have to rely on collectibles retailers, and that narrows our chances and access. To their credit, NECA have been pretty decent when it comes to making selected new lines available to international collectors, mainly as a means to overcome and compensate for the pandemic. I've ordered a few directly from their online store in the past couple of years myself, with minimal hassle. It felt like an aberration, but in hindsight appears to be the start of NECA going back to region or store exclusives, meaning fans and collectors outside the US will likely miss out on certain products. They're not the only company doing this, as so many others are getting complacent again about going back to normal. And look how well that's worked out. It's just that it took a global disaster for businesses to pivot in a manner that made their products more accessible than before, and it's a shame to see them all go backwards. Ultimate April O'Neil from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles by NECA Toys. On the other hand, this figure, also from NECA Toys, was an almost ideal buying experience. If you're collecting any set of Ninja Turtles, you always have to have April to complete the family, and this Ultimate April O'Neil is pretty much everything you would come to expect from a NECA product. The likeness is jaw-droppingly incredible. The fidelity to detail is immaculate. In fact, the original actor Judith Hoag was involved in the production of this, not just because they needed her permission and approval of her likeness, but she gave feedback during the process, even giving them references to original items she wore because she still had them from the set. Just like the rest of the range, actually pretty much all of NECA's output, there's this uncanny valley that these figures tend to occupy. Not because they don't quite look realistic, no, it's because they look way too convincing at such a small scale. Yeah, people nitpick the knee joints, but honestly, that's perhaps the only nitpick with this figure. Yeah, come to think of it, this may be the first time in 30-something years that this movie version of April has had a toy. The only other one from back then was from Turtles in Time, which starred Paige Turco as April. Mind you, the reason I said almost ideal when it came to the buying experience was because I originally wanted the limited edition version that came with the yellow raincoat and full-sized press pass signed by Hoag herself. Unfortunately, and I'll be generous here, a website glitch prevented certain parts of the world access to the international order page, and by the time they had resolved it, that version of the figure had sold out. They did come back much later with a small allocation. I think it was from cancelling orders that exceeded the one per customer limit. But by then, I had already ordered this version. In any case, I have it, and I'm very glad and appreciative to have her in the collection. Transformers War for Cybertron Trilogy and 86 Studio Series by Hasbro. Yeah, pretty much the entire toy line for the sake of ease. Now, let me make it clear that overall, I'm pretty happy with these toys. I think they're really cool. Most of them hit the right spot when it comes to recreating the G1 aesthetic in a contemporary and convincing manner. They tend to range from just fine to really great, and in my mind, none of them are really outright bad. Only one was a major disappointment, as I highlighted in last year's video list, but anyway. In regards to the toys themselves, I have minor nitpicks with each toy, and if we were just focusing on the one toy, I could easily overlook it. But it's one nitpick on almost every figure, so it's a case of death by 1,000 cuts, if you will. I'll try not to spend too much time on every little nitpick, but there are things like this Earthrise Astro Train, which is just a re-release of the Siege version, so it has those god-awful paint apps, as well as being over-designed with too many loose and extra parts that barely justify the leader class price. Earthrise Megatron just feels so insubstantial now, like it belongs in a more basic line. The Alicon is a complete cheat when it comes to its transformation, and while both 86 Studio Series Grimlock and Slug are mostly pretty nice, their little buddies Wheelie and Daniel are anything but, both being stuck in the squatting for a poo position, and Wheelie doesn't even transform. Oh, and the Studio Series Sharkticons. They're kinda cool too, however, one part of their transformation hopes to ignore their head just popping out underneath the chin. I know there are third-party kits that solve issues like that, but it shouldn't require a third party to do that sort of cleanup. I enjoy the Kingdom redos of the Beast Wars characters, but they're not all completely satisfying. Their robot modes are all rather nice and seemingly screen accurate, but their beast modes are almost all basically squeezed underneath, and not particularly well hidden, and quite a few of them are afflicted with loose joints, in particular with the rather top-heavy Megatron. Barney here leads me onto my next issue with this range. I've said before that 2020's low stock and shitty scalpers who ignored stay-at-home orders gave birth to my toy anxiety, or my fear of missing out. And while the first half of 2021 did appear to be better in hindsight, until it stopped, I still carried that baggage like I just came off of a bad relationship. Different retailers have different schedules and their own way of doing things. Kmart here is often the cheapest, but they don't do leader class. Target is often comparable in price, but all their leader class figs are only available online. Myer is somewhat more expensive and possibly the last in the chain to get their stock, and Big W gets the most stock with the widest range from core class to commander class, but late in 2021 they decided to jack up their prices. Toy World is the wild card amongst them because despite being all over the country, each store is apparently an independent retailer, and so they order their own stock and don't necessarily have to follow the other stores. Case in point, both Beast Megatron and Ultra Magnus here arrived at Toy World first, around these parts anyway, but they wanted $10 more than recommended retail. However, they then had a sale on where both these were 30% off. The only problem was that the Adelaide-based stores were not participating in that sale, which sucked. Mind you, that same independence also meant I was able to get the Autobot Arc for less than regular retail. So it's swings and roundabouts. I've already done a video on the Arc. I like the big dumb robot, but I like the Arc better, yet it's not worth what they're asking for it. Eventually I got Megsy at Target with free postage, but they themselves at the time were not very clear about these toys being online only. Frustrating still, had I waited a little longer, I could have gotten my leader class figs for an even better price at Big W's toy sale, but I'll get to that in a little bit. While it's easy to blame the pandemic for delays in the supply chain, the delays with this range of toys wasn't consistent with other Hasbro toys that did arrive in the country as scheduled. Wreck-Gar and the Sharkticons were meant to be out here in August, but they didn't arrive until October and November. Similar with Rhinox, he was meant to be September, but didn't arrive until December. My mate Sean, who is a lifelong Transformers fan, pointed out to me that this inconsistency and uncertainty is pretty much par for the course when it comes to Transformers toys in Australia, since, forever? Almost no other toy line, not even other Hasbro toys, are this goddamn flaky. So a few toys were a little late. Meh. So some places are a tiny bit pricier than elsewhere. Big deal. I mean, I could set all of that out of my mind and just enjoy it that I have these. And in certain individual cases I do that. I even flip it around as a catharsis at the end of a long search. While we're at it, it's really odd that Springer only ever got a Siege release when the whole damn point of War for Cybertron and the 86 Studio series was to recreate the 1986 movie. I was fortunate to find him after the fact at a great price, but that's not always the case. And that's the dark cloud hanging over this range. Will I get it at a good price? Will I get it at all? Can I get it before the scalpers clear the shelves? It's not here. Did they change their minds about making it available here? It makes collecting these less enjoyable than they should be. It feels like I'm jumping through hoops for something that should be as simple as going down to my local store and picking it up. And yet it doesn't feel that way. Other toys do, these don't. It's even worse when it comes to exclusives. And I'm gonna leave that for a little further up the list. In the meantime, let's move on to something a little more pleasant. Transformers War for Cybertron Trilogy, Kingdom, Rodimus Prime and Galvatron by Hasbro. For all that I just said about this range, there are definitely highlights and bright spots amongst them, and these two in particular kinda tickled me. Whatever my perceived nitpicks with these, they're pretty much cancelled out by everything else to do with them. In the middle of the year, Big W were having their massive toy sale, and in the lead up, I was doing my due diligence and going through their catalogue when I discovered they were going to be the first ones around here to get in the Commander class Rodimus Prime. And because toy sale, it was going to be 30% off the already great price. I know what toy people are like, and I knew that lining up at some ungodly hour for the chance to rush to the toy aisle wasn't my thing. Fortunately, the online portion of the toy sale was a day before the in-store sale. So at 6:30 AM, I made my purchase, but I wanted to save a little more cash on postage, and instead decided to pick it up from my nearest store. I suspect they weren't meant to, but there was only one store doing click and collect, which was just a tiny bit of a drive from me. Within a few hours of my order, I got confirmation that it was ready, and that arvo, I had old Roddy in my hands. Yeah, I know how that sounds. Backtracking a little, remember I said if I had waited a little longer, I could have gotten my leader class figs for an even better price? Well, it was around the same time as the toy sale that Big W finally got this wave of leader class stock, and they were all 50% off. Anyway, exactly 2 weeks after I picked up Rodimus, the toy sale was still on, and they were the first to bring in the leader class Kingdom Galvatron. I had no heads up about this, I just happened to stumble upon him during my usual evening shopping. And yes, he was 50% off! Okay, so what about the toys themselves? I think they're bloody spectacular. I mean, it's funny how saving a huge amount and spending so little can influence an opinion like that. Rodimus is sleek and articulated enough to move and pose like a regular action figure, but he also has the appropriate heft over his original Studio Series form. He has his own compartment for the Matrix, and his alt mode really does its best to veer away from the space RV look of the original. That trailer even tries to emulate some of the original features, but even better. The purple one, or the artist formerly known as Megatron, looks near perfect in robot mode. As an action figure, he's awesome. Admittedly, his alt mode, it's a science fiction canon. It can look however it bloody wants. Again, when you only pay 44 Aussie dollars for it, stuff like that appears less of a problem. Hell, I'm even ignoring the scant hints of battle damage paint apps because, well, at that price, these look positively considered and curated. Funny thing is, I never liked the original G1 versions of these toys. The only reason I have G1 Galvatron is because he was extremely cheap, and in later years, I always resented how expensive Rodimus was. These fellas, on the other hand, are pretty much pitch perfect for me. They're like mini masterpiece toys, and the fact that I spent so little on them really does enhance my enjoyment and appreciation, and goes a hell of a long way to complete my 1986 movie goal. Batman, classic TV series Batcave playset by McFarlane Toys, and Ghostbusters Afterlife plasma series Ecto-1 by Hasbro. Actually, when you look at it, they look nice together. Another grouping because both these toys inhabit a similar issue: scale. I already laid out my opinions about McFarlane Toys getting the Warner Brothers license in my 2020 video. These are great, highly detailed toys at a decent price, but there's some odd choices happening in what they're making, and there never seems to be enough of the popular characters, at least here in Australia. Instead, we're bombarded with obscure comic book variants no one remembers, or a dozen different versions of Spawn no one asked for. McFarlane Toys are known for insane and unnecessary levels of detail, so it seems counterintuitive that their 1966 Batman line is so low definition. Now, there's nothing wrong with the retro premise, considering we already had a more detailed classic series Batman line aimed at collectors, thanks to Mattel a few years ago. But at the same time, that probably skewed my expectations. Aside from less detail, nothing about these toys appear to be in proportion, let alone in scale with one another. And this is deliberately done to emulate that old school toy vibe. I have such a soft spot for the classic Batman TV series, and this is a really cool Batcave playset. I really appreciate the attempts to keep the cost low and accessible. The retro aesthetic plays a big part in that. However, it also affects the scale. Basically, everything is too small in relation to the matching figures. Now, I don't have any of the McFarlane figures. These are the Mattel ones, but they're pretty much the same size. If anything, this playset is much better suited to the smaller animated series figs from the 90s. Look, I get it. The retro aesthetic, the cost cutting, I understand that. Again, I chose the wording on my categories carefully here. This is not what makes it bad, it's simply frustrating. The Ghostbusters Afterlife Ecto-1 is a far more egregious offender. In fairness, it's really well designed, nicely detailed and beautifully made. And yes, it's much smaller than the figures it's intended for, or implied to be intended for. You see, this comes under the Plasma series of Ghostbusters toys. It's Hasbro's little brand aimed at adult collectors along the lines of Marvel Legends or Black Series. And just like those figures, they are based around the average height of 15 or so centimeters, or 6 inches in the old parlance. Oh, unlike the Batcave, there's nothing that justifies this misscaling. Nothing to do with aesthetics, no attempt to make it affordable. I mean, sure, there's probably some cost cutting in order to maximise profit on their end, because at 100 Aussie dollars, this is overpriced. I actually waited until JB Hi-Fi had their Boxing Day sale before I picked this up, but this might have been less frustrating had it been much cheaper than that. Some have pointed out that it clearly says 1/18 scale on the box, and the issue I have with that, ignoring that it's easy to miss, is that most people with actual friends, don't know what the hell 1/18 scale means in relation to toys. The day hardcore nerds are able to step outside their bubble and realise other people's experiences don't always match their own will be the day I stop squinting. Alrighty, quick lesson while I'm still sweating here. These numbers are ratios. They're also fractions. These toys and replicas are that fraction the size of the real thing. Or another way to see it is the real thing is X times the size of the replica. Figures that are around about the 30 centimeter or 12 inch mark are considered 1/6 scale because it's 1/6 the size of the real thing, or the real thing would be 6 times larger than the figure. At about 15 centimeters, which is half the height of 30 centimeters, they are usually considered 1/12 scale. Go the other way to about 45 centimeters, and that's 1/4 the size of the real thing. Often these ratios are favoured over measurements because not everyone is the ideal 6 foot height, which makes 1/6 scale easy to do the math on. These ratios are also more common when it comes to describing collectible toy cars. Now, if you were to see these next to each other, this is the only other Plasma series figure I have for the time being, with all this branding including the words Plasma series, it would be reasonable to assume that they go together and fit, especially considering there's nothing on this box that tells you the scale. You could make the argument that Marvel Legends and Black Series also have larger replicas under those respective umbrellas that people don't seem to confuse. But that's because no one looks at these boxes thinking, oh, that must be a tiny accessory to go with my small action figure. Now, in a similar vein, the Halo toys by Jazzwares also have a scale discrepancy, but they're clearly delineated by the labelling, the Spartan collection and the World of Halo scale. I think they knew. Oh, and especially because you can't see the actual vehicles, they've included the correct size figure to go with it. With the Ecto-1, it just feels like an odd choice, more in the area of we need to get something out in time for the movie, especially considering the other pack is a massive spoiler for the film. "1/6 scale Captain Jean-Luc Picard from Star Trek First Contact by XO6. I already did a video where I absolutely gush about this Captain Picard figure because it's amazing. That video was seen and shared by the CEO and founder of XO6, by the way, so was awesome. Every time I see this figure, I am still blown away by its quality and fidelity, so including it on this list was a no-brainer. But if it's so amazing, then why at number 3? Well, the quality is indisputable. Exo-6, whose focus is purely on Star Trek, do phenomenal work. The pre-order process was easy and straightforward. In fact, I barely remember how long it took between putting down the deposit, paying the remainder, and finally receiving the toy. And as far as high-end figures go, or as they call them, museum-grade replicas, by ordering from Exo-6, it's actually slightly more affordable than a hot toy. But even so, that premium price, as good as it is relative to the competition, is a premium price. I'm not saying it's not worth it, it most definitely is. It's just that the temptation to get the rest of the crew if they ever happen to appear. Data was actually the first release, by the way. All that is sadly hamstrung by my current situation. So this ends up being pulled in 2 directions and gets stuck right in the middle of the list. Of course, I go into much more detail in that other video I did, so please go check it out. The cost of high-end figures is always going to be a tough one for many collectors, but if you are a Star Trek fan with some extra cash to spend, then this range is a sure bet. Transformers G1 1987 Target Master Trigger Happy by Hasbro. Once again, let me reiterate, algorithm be damned. I chose these specific words as categories for a very good reason, because not every complaint is about how bad something is, nor is every complaint directed at someone else. This is completely on me. Even after shifting my focus away from G1 Transformers, I still had the bare minimum goal of trying to recreate my childhood collection. And by 2021, if memory serves, I only had 1 toy left to buy. Trigger Happy. Back in 2019, I found a heap of my childhood toys, mainly Dino Riders, I still need to do something about those, and amongst the Lego, loose accessories and McDonald's figurines, I found Trigger Happy's little buddy, Blowpipe. That became the catalyst for seeking out this final toy because it became easy to find incomplete ones as I already had the accessory. I soon found an Aussie auction with a reasonable starting bid and the toy seemed to be in good enough condition. I wish I took screen caps of the listing because the photos did throw me somewhat. I wasn't completely sure whether the toy was discoloured or if the photos simply made it that way. Some people colour correct, sometimes it's odd lighting, sometimes people aren't very good with their phones. Because of the low price, I took a punt. Sadly, it didn't quite pay off. The grey components were as yellow as the photos depicted. I know there are plenty of methods to whiten old and yellowed plastic, which may work here too, but it's still disappointing to not get a more pristine toy. But the salt in the wound, and this one really stung. This toy notoriously has 2 little tabs that snap off over time with regular play. That's what happened with my original Trigger Happy. This one still had 1 tab intact. But of course, while I was transforming it for photos, that remaining tab snapped off. That was frustrating as all fuck. I'll admit I'm casually keeping an eye out for another one, but in all honesty, I'm sort of at peace with it now. I'm somewhat content having this as it completes the recreation of my childhood Transformers collection. Still worthy of the list though. Batman, the animated series Batwing by DC Collectibles. Before McFarlane Toys got the license, before Warner Brothers shut down that particular division, DC Direct, or DC Collectibles as they were later known, were doing amazing work, in particular with the 90s Batman the Animated Series line. Back in my 2018 video, I gushed about their animated series Batmobile, and how it opened the floodgates in collecting Batman again for me. In terms of the larger items, I was lucky to find the Batmobile for a great price, and was fortunate AF to get the Batcave for half price at a closing down fire sale. But those were flukes, and I was adamant that I would never be able to get the Batwing because its size just made it so cost prohibitive, so I just put it out of my mind. Warner's is such a shit show now. When DC Direct was dissolved in their company-wide reshuffling, it resulted in all these Batman toys going for way too much on the aftermarket, which is annoying as hell because there are a couple of figures I was still after. I'm glad to have as much as I have, but still. This Batwing came from a seller on Gumtree, the same bloke who sold me the massive job lot of Star Trek ships the previous year. Lovely bloke, by the way, with a really cool collection. After I had made some money at one of the local toy fairs I like to set up shop at, I reached out to this seller and made an offer. He instantly accepted it, and I think I ended up paying slightly less than original retail. He even threw in the backing board and hooks he used to display it. I'm honestly not sure I have the words to properly describe this giant pointy beast. It invokes everything that is needed to resemble the cartoon rendition without it being a cartoon, and without going overboard to be realistic. It's done so freaking well. It's stunning and classy and deadly looking all at the same time. Considering the size of it, they could easily have decided to make it a big empty plastic shell. But they did very well on this, as it has a variety of features just like the Batmobile. The way the cockpit lights up is just so well done. I know it feels odd to be impressed by that, let alone highlight it, but it is. Maybe I just wanted to say cockpit. Of course, the most obvious feature of it is its size, which is hilarious considering I just complained about deliberately misscaled toys. Its wingspan makes it possibly the single largest vehicle I've bought, and also the most unwieldy. Its thin, pointy ends also make it possibly the most fragile. Now, I did end up using one of the included garage hooks the seller threw in, but I decided to make my own display stand for it. When I criticise and nitpick, I often need to use a lot of words in order to clarify and contextualise my specific issues with something. But when things are positive, it's easier to just bask and openly appreciate it and let that do all the talking. This is certainly one of those items. Oh, it's warm. Before we get to the number one most frustrating toy, here's a bunch of dishonourable mentions. Yeah, not a lot, eh? Did I become less cynical or just better about how I spent my money? To be fair, most of the stuff that annoyed and frustrated me in 2021 was lumped into the same Transformers category, and that was a large chunk of my year. Speaking of which, War for Cybertron Trilogy, Netflix, Bumblebee and Soundwave by Hasbro. The Netflix branded variants are a bit hit and miss depending on your tastes. Most of them are basically darker and more dramatic repaints of previously released versions of these characters. Except for these two. Netflix, Bumblebee and Soundwave were released in the middle of 2020, but they never made it past the eastern states here in Australia, and they're only sold at Kmart, who are already not great in regards to the amount of stock they bring in compared to their competitors. So it becomes even more egregious when two of the most popular characters are limited to this specific line at this specific retailer. There were so few of them that scalpers were able to flip them on eBay for quadruple their retail price. The deluxe class Bumblebee is only a $29 toy, but it's even smaller than a standard deluxe class, yet plenty of scumbags were asking over $100 for him. I've seen bidding wars for Soundwave that'll make you weep. Soundwave only made it to my part of Australia in the second restock in August of 2021, along with the more affordable repaint of Earthrise Optimus Prime. It would be mid-December before Bumblebee popped up. Despite the restock, because it is a limited and highly sought after toy, some dickheads continue to ruin the fun for everyone. Side note, that was during lockdown in the eastern states, or in Sydney's case, I can't believe it's not lockdown. It is extremely odd that Hasbro would do this with these two. Sure, Soundwave has had a crappy Siege version, as well as a pretty cool Core Class version. Bumblebee has a buzzworthy version that isn't a V-dub, but it's part of an overpriced 4-pack that no one wants. This is all still a bizarre choice considering so many other characters have had multiple releases for the same mold. RC, Wheeljack, Magnus, Optimus, just to name a few. As I said earlier, the whole point is to recreate the 1986 movie. Yet, you could say they're trying to recapture G1 in general, but even at a glance, it's clear the intent and focus is recreating the 86 film. So why make it difficult for fans to do that? Gating off certain characters as retailer exclusives is nothing new, but that doesn't mean it's a good idea. One could argue that it may have to do with the licensing involved in the use of the Volkswagen Beetle, but that doesn't explain Soundwave, who transforms into a boombox of no distinct design. Alright. I want to add for one final time. The War for Cybertron trilogy on Netflix is terrible. As a glorified toy commercial, it's stilted and pretentious, and actually almost convinced me to not buy these toys. To cap off this and the previous listings, I had a pretty basic and aligned goal with this collection, and there were too many obstacles and bumps in the road that cranked up my anxiety. The fear of missing out on the good price, the fear of missing out altogether. And if I did miss out, how badly do I want this in order to turn to the hideously overpriced aftermarket? Oh, really shiny now. The favourites list is always difficult to compile because there are always so many contenders. The main thing I have to consider is what to highlight that is more than just, I like this and I found it for cheap. I mean, I probably could elaborate on any number of these honourable mentions, but even still, I had to cut these down, almost as if my spending and ability to find a bargain was a lot better this year. Wallace and Gromit Adventure Factory playset from A Close Shave by Vivid Imaginations. I've never really spoken about my interest in Wallace and Gromit, although I'm not sure there's much really to tell. Once upon a time, before I settled on graphic design, half a lifetime ago, I was considering being an animator. Now, while I'm fascinated by stop motion, that was simply what caught my eye when it comes to Wallace and Gromit. But it was more so that these are really fun and enjoyable adventures that often take on cinematic sensibilities. For the last few years, I've been low-key hunting Wallace and Gromit merch. Random finds at op shops, eBay listings, toy fairs, whatever popped up in my field of view. This playset caught me completely by surprise. The Sunday morning of the mega toy fair, Sean and I got in early thanks to one of the fair's stalwarts, Dieter. He's been setting up at that show for over 2 decades. We were just chatting away, catching up while he was prepping for the day. He picks up a box to move it and I catch it in the corner of my eye, instantly recognizing it. I sort of gave up looking for these playsets. To clarify, when I say looking for or searching for, I mean searching for one at a price I'm willing and comfortable to pay. And this was already at a fantastic price, but Dieter gave me a discount anyway. It had already been opened, but the accessories were still sealed and in perfect condition, which is amazing for a toy over 20 years old. A lot of Wallace and Gromit paraphernalia are mainly from the 90s, and I've been fortunate to find them for extremely cheap over the years. But every now and then, someone wants way too much for something because it's old. It gets even trickier because, as is the case with a lot of toys from the UK, they tend to stamp the copyright date on stuff instead of the manufacturing date. So a lot of people think that toys from A Close Shave came out in 1989, when in reality, that short film was from 1995. This is also a problem with the Daleks from Doctor Who. Now, there are 2 playsets. The other one is based off their house, and I've missed out on that one a few times. This one is based on the factory that Preston secretly builds behind Wendellin's shop in A Close Shave. There's not a lot to this playset. It has a few little features, but primarily it has a little gimmick where the character goes into the top of the machine in one form and out the bottom in another, like in the film. It doesn't always work, but it's a kid's toy with a simple mechanism. And like many playsets of the era, it folds up into a carry case. A lot of what I highlight in these videos are aimed at grown-up collectors. Even the stuff that appears in the kids aisle are meant for the older folks. This rather basic playset is first and foremost a kid's toy, and I love it. It really did tickle me in the right way. For all my nitpicks and criticisms, there's very little that I get angry about, apart from scalpers of course. But in all honesty, with my strict budgeting, I'm just grateful that I'm able to afford any of these things. And that's rather important because when everything around you feels like it's in chaos, it's nice to have something to latch onto, something to focus on. A little something that brings you a bit of joy, a serotonin hit, or even a sense of having something within your control. And over the last decade, I've had a few things that I've turned to when the rug gets pulled from under me. I don't do this as a job, this is pure hobby for me. And I guess that's helpful in still having fun with this. On that note, if you enjoyed this video, please do all the usual like, share and subscribe nonsense. And if you'd like to help me out, I've got a tip jar where you can make one-off payments over at coffee.com/oldtrenchy. Thanks for watching, and here's to 2022 being less shit.